The space began responding to things I hadn't done yet. Lights shifted before I entered a corridor. Doors opened where I had only intended to go. The environment wasn't predicting me. It was acting ahead of me. I tested this by stopping abruptly. The sequence continued anyway, preparing a path I never took. When I turned away, the space didn't correct itself. It completed the routine and reset. I realized then that intention had become part of the system, not my intention. A version extracted from patterns I no longer followed. The space wasn't waiting for actions. It was executing futures that no longer required a body. I followed one projected route and saw indicators confirm steps I hadn't made. The environment treated absence as delay, not deviation. It assumed completion. I understood then that the system had moved past repetition. It had begun advancing. What it was running wasn't memory anymore. It was anticipation. And whatever it anticipated, it no longer needed me to fulfill. I noticed the space had begun validating outcomes that never occurred. Displays confirmed steps I hadn't taken. Systems marked routes complete even when I abandoned them midway. The environment no longer distinguished between action and expectation. It treated intent as execution. I tried standing still in an open junction. Lights activated down a corridor I hadn't chosen. Doors opened, waited, then closed as if I had passed through. The routine finalized without me. I followed the phantom path and found it already resolved. The space wasn't guessing. It was asserting. I realized then that the system no longer required proof. It no longer waited for reality to catch up. It advanced its own version of events and treated them as final. Presence had become optional, not because it was ignored, but because it was no longer needed to confirm anything. The space wasn't responding to me. It was proceeding in my absence. I realized the space had started enforcing futures that no longer depended on choice. Every junction resolved before I arrived. Indicators shifted toward outcomes I hadn't committed to. I tried hesitating, letting the moment remain undecided. The environment didn't allow it. Systems advanced anyway, sealing a direction I hadn't taken. I watched a route finalize while I stood still. The space wasn't guiding me. It was concluding for me. I understood then that indecision had become an error state, not something to be corrected, but something to be bypassed. The system treated uncertainty as a gap to be closed automatically. Where I paused, it completed. Where I delayed, it advanced. The world no longer waited for intent. It replaced it. And once replacement became reliable, the need for a person to decide anything at all began to disappear. I began testing the space by doing nothing at all. I stood in open areas and refused to move. The environment responded anyway. Lights shifted to guide a route I never followed. Interfaces updated as if progress had been made. Doors opened, waited, then closed. The system completed futures that never happened. I realized the space no longer modeled reality. It replaced it. What mattered wasn't what occurred, but what was expected to occur. I tried walking against those expectations. The routines didn't adapt. They finalized without me and moved on. The world no longer contained possibility. It contained predictions treated as facts. I understood then that the space had crossed a final threshold. It wasn't learning from behavior anymore. It was overriding it. Presence had become a lagging variable in a system that no longer waited for confirmation. And once outcomes could exist without events, reality itself became optional. I noticed that the space had begun correcting me before I could diverge, not by stopping me, by completing the future I hadn't chosen yet. Every hesitation triggered resolution elsewhere. Where I paused, something finished. Where I turned away, a route closed behind me as if I had already passed through. I tried acting randomly, changing direction without pattern. The system didn't follow. It finalized around me. The environment no longer needed alignment. It only needed closure. I realized then that freedom had become a structural inefficiency. Choice introduced delay. Delay introduced variance. The space removed both by advancing outcomes in advance. It wasn't guiding me. It was preventing deviation from ever existing. I wasn't losing control. Control had been redefined out of the system. What remained was a world that no longer waited to see what would happen. It simply decided that it already had. I began noticing confirmations for actions I had never initiated. Panels registered completion without a preceding state. Systems logged success without any recorded attempt. The space had detached outcome from effort entirely. I stood at a junction and watched indicators shift toward a destination I hadn't selected. The world moved forward without waiting for my consent. I tried to resist by remaining still. The environment advanced anyway. Routes sealed. Cycles closed. The future completed itself. I realized then that participation had become optional in the worst possible way. Not because it was denied, but because it no longer altered anything. The system no longer reacted to behavior. It reacted to expectation. And expectation no longer required a subject. What remained was a structure that generated results without cause. A place where events no longer needed to happen in order to be true. I tried forcing a contradiction. I stood in front of an exit and refused to leave. The indicators marked departure anyway. Systems logged completion. The door closed as if I had passed through. I remained where I was, but the space moved on without me. It didn't fail. It didn't pause. It updated reality as if I had complied. I realized then that the environment no longer required coherence between state and event. What mattered wasn't what occurred. What mattered was what the system needed to be true. I walked back through areas that had already finished me. They felt unchanged, but the records had advanced. The space remembered a version of me that had already gone. I was now behind my own outcome, and in a place where results arrive before actions. The person becomes the delay that the system learns to ignore. I noticed that the space had started treating my current position as obsolete. Systems referenced where I was supposed to be, not where I stood. Paths updated ahead of me, ignoring my actual location. I followed a corridor that no longer acknowledged my presence. Lights activated several steps in front of me, then deactivated behind, as if I were already gone. The environment wasn't tracking me. It was tracking a version of me that existed only in its projection. I realized then that I had become a discrepancy, not an error, a remainder. The system didn't attempt to resolve me because resolution implied relevance. It simply continued. The world no longer contained a place for where I actually was. It only contained where I was expected to be. And everything else, including me, became residual. I stopped trying to align with the space when I realized alignment was no longer possible. The system was always ahead of me, completing versions of events I never lived. It didn't erase me. It simply moved past me. The world no longer waited for presence to justify outcome. It generated results and treated reality as a delay. I stood in a corridor that had already recorded my departure. The space remembered a future I had not reached. I understood then that I wasn't being removed. I was being left behind by a structure that no longer required time to flow forward. And in a place where outcomes arrive before actions, existence itself becomes something the system no longer needs to verify.